is your story? Enter the story.
So in our Lenten journey this year, we are entering into the Passion of Jesus and looking at the moments of risk that took Jesus from a parade at the city gates to a cross on the outskirts of town. Last week, Jesus and his followers risked their reputations to show God on the side of the poor and oppressed and challenged the empire's idea that might makes right. Today, we zoom in on the temple courts where Jesus is risking righteous anger as he flips over tables and chases out money changers. And some of you may remember that a few weeks ago we actually touched on this story as we talked about anger. And we talked about Jesus getting angry about the right things, like people being exploited and people being hurt and harassed and mistreated. And that we often get angry about the wrong things, like when somebody messes up our Starbucks order, right? And so, and we kind of ended with this challenge that we need to be more like Jesus in the sense that we get angry about the right things. Aristotle once wrote this: anyone can become angry. That is easy. But to be angry with the right person and to the right degree and at the right time and for the right purpose and in the right way is not within everyone's reach and is not easy. I think we could all probably agree with that, right? It's easy for us to get angry, but getting angry for the right reason, to the right person, at the right time, and to the right degree is much more difficult. And every time I've looked at and studied and read and tried to understand this particular passage, the question for me has always been, what is Jesus angry about? Who is he angry with? What is he angry about? What is going on that would cause this reaction? And like many theologians, I understood Jesus' anger to be aimed at the vendors and the temple leaders for exploiting the people and taking advantage of the people who came to worship God. But as the Rabbi Abraham Heschel says, Scripture is like a prism. Every time we hold it up to the light, we see something different. And so I went back and this time around I looked at that Scripture again. And here's an example of seeing something different every time we hold Scripture up to the light. I always thought that this scene that Jesus creates when he goes and flips over tables and chases the money lenders, the money changers out of the temple, I always thought this scene was like a huge disruption. That it totally shut everything down. And am I the only one that's thought that? I mean, isn't that kind of the image that we get, right? That it totally shuts. We even see it in the movies, right? Jesus comes raging through the temple. He's yelling. He's flipping. There's coins falling in slow motion to the floor, right? But here's the thing. I didn't understand the sheer size of the temple. The temple is about the size, or was about the size of 12 football fields end to end. That's huge, right? I mean, and think about one person coming in one corner, flipping over some tables and yelling at some folks. Like, would people even notice? It'd be like a dude at Quail Springs Mall getting mad in Macy's and flipping stuff over and yelling at the clerks at the Macy's, right? The people shopping in JCPenney wouldn't even notice. They wouldn't even have an idea that anything was going on. Now, the people who would notice would be the security, right? Mall security would notice. The managers would notice. people in leadership, people in charge would notice. The media might even notice. It might make the news. And so there's no way that it was going to shut everything down. But perhaps Jesus' intent wasn't even to shut everything down. Perhaps Jesus' intent was to make a point. This was a symbolic protest, kind of like the coming in, the triumphal entry, the coming in by the back gate with his own parade. That maybe this was a way of him trying to make a point with the people who would notice, like the temple guards and the temple priests. So what was it that he was protesting? And maybe some of the people that were just right around there. So what was it that he was protesting? What was it that had him so riled up? Well, like I said earlier, one thought is that he was protesting the corruption and the exploitation by the temple leaders. And that was the thing that he was going after. But there's at least one scholar, A.J. Levine, who wrote Entering the Passion of Jesus, who has a different idea of maybe what he was going after. She argues that the money changers and the sacrificial animal vendors, that they were a necessary part of temple life. She argued that people who would come to sacrifice their animal, or who would come to the temple on a pilgrimage during Passover, wouldn't bring an animal 300 miles over the road with them. They would have to get an animal there. And that because the Roman coins have an image of the emperor on it, they're unclean. You can't use that in the temple. So you have to change the money out in order to buy an animal to sacrifice. And so it makes sense for them to be there. And she says that there's not a historical record of exploitation that we know of. So what if we gave the temple leaders the benefit of the doubt? What if we gave them the benefit of the doubt? What if we said that okay, you know what? The vendors were doing what they were supposed to be doing. The money changers were doing what they were supposed to be doing. The temple leaders were doing what they were supposed to be doing. Then what else might he be protesting? Well, we kind of think about the way the temple is laid out. The temple has several courts. All right, so we have this big structure that's 120 yards long. In the very center of it is the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum. This is where God's presence resides. The only people that ever get to go in there are the high priests. And even then, they only go once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to get forgiveness for their sins and for the sins of all the people. And then outside of that, you have a small ring that's the court of priests, where the priests come and they do their duties. And then outside of that, there's a slightly larger ring that is the court of Israel. And that's where the Jewish men come to worship. And outside of that, a slightly larger ring that is the court of women, where the Jewish women come to worship. And then outside of all of that, the biggest ring is the court of Gentiles. And the court of Gentiles is where the people who are not Jewish but want to worship God could come and worship. Because the temple was a house of prayer for all nations, right? And Jesus was adamant about the idea that God was a God of all people, not just the Jewish people, but that God was everyone's God. And so this was a place where this court of Gentiles was the place where the Gentiles could come and worship. Well, in many ways, over the years, and that's the way it was designed, that's the way it was set up. But over the years, as people came this was the center of life, and this was the place where you came every year for your pilgrimage and everything, what happened was the temple kind of became more like a tourist attraction. In a way, the temple kind of became a place that people, when they travel, it was kind of almost like St. Peter's Basilica. Right? If y'all can remember a little bit of your history, or St. Peter's Basilica is where the Sistine Chapel is, and the Michelangelo's famous painting on the ceiling. Right? 90% of the people, now that is a cathedral, it's a church. But 90% of the people who come there don't come to worship. They come to ooh and ah at the ceiling. Right? And all the other stuff that's around. And so over time, what had happened is as people came each year for this, they were coming and they were seeing old friends, they were hanging out, they were having fun, they were getting to eat meat instead of fish for once, they were getting to having picnics and catching up on old times, and they were kind of coming like tourists, especially during the pilgrimage festivals, and especially in the court of Gentiles. Because see, what happened was the vendors, these money changers and these vendors, were in the court of Gentiles. They didn't used to be. They weren't always in the court of Gentiles. At one time, they were outside the temple walls. They were required to be outside the temple walls. But over time, they kind of laxed up on the rules. And they allowed them to move in to that court. They said, well, there's plenty of space in here. Why don't you just sit up right here? And so now people are coming. They're going to the money changer. They're going to the vendors. And, well, as long as the money changers are here, as long as the animal vendors are here, we might as well have somebody selling burkas over here. And have somebody selling coffee mugs that says, I went to the temple. And a shirt that says I went to the temple, and maybe a tour guide or two. And suddenly, all of a sudden, this place that was intended to be the place of worship for the Gentiles who couldn't go into the other parts of the temple has now become a marketplace. This place has now become like Times Square. And imagine if you were a Gentile who wanted to worship God, and you went to this temple, and instead of being able to worship God, you were constantly surrounded by noise and other people hanging out and taking selfies and everything else. It'd be hard to do, wouldn't it? Would you feel welcomed into God's presence? Would you feel pushed away from God? Blocked, maybe, from God? And so each year, Jesus comes to the temple and he sees the Jews acting more like tourists than pilgrims. And he sees Gentiles who want to worship and can't. And he gets tired of it. And he decides to make a point. And so he flips over some tables to get people's attention, and he yells, take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. Is it not written, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations? But you've made it a den of robbers. So Jesus was upset at the lack of hospitality. We see that theme over and over again in Scripture, that God gets upset at the Israelites when they are unwilling to be hospitable to people who aren't like them. And so he was upset at their lack of hospitality, their unwillingness to welcome in the stranger and to make space for them to be able to worship God. But what about the den of robbers? What does that have to do with anything? Well, if we think about it, a robber's den is not where robbers go to rob, right? A robber's den is where robbers go to count their loot and lay low before they go out and rob again, right? Makes sense. You think about the Jesse James hideouts and those types of things. And so a robber's den, when he's talking about this robber's den, he's actually making a reference to something that Jeremiah says and he talks about. When Jeremiah makes that statement, he is saying that the people of Israel aren't taking their worship seriously. That you go out all week and you sin, and you come in and you do your little bit to feel better, and then and get absolved, and you go right back to doing what you were doing. But you don't actually change anything. You don't actually try to be better. The question is, do we sometimes treat church like that? Do we sometimes treat church as a place where we go to get absolved of our sin and to feel better before we go out and just sin some more? Or do we come to church to be made more like Jesus? Are we coming like tourists? Or are we coming like pilgrims? Are we making outsiders feel welcomed and invited and creating space for them in this holy place? You know, Jesus said he came to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Often when we come to worship, we are world weary, right? I get here on Sunday morning and I need me some Jesus. Now, hopefully we're getting some Jesus a little bit every day, but sometimes, getting Jesus together is just different than getting Jesus on your own, isn't it? Yeah. And I get to church on Sunday morning and I am world weary, and we need this time together to be lifted up and to be encouraged and to be inspired, right? We need to hear God's message of grace and peace when we come. But Jesus doesn't just want to help us feel better. Jesus also wants us to be better, right? To do better. That means sometimes Jesus is going to flip over some tables in our lives and challenge us so that we can go into the world not only refreshed, not only encouraged, but also empowered to be the hands and feet of Jesus in the world. Are you willing to risk Jesus' righteous anger in your life? Let's pray. God, we thank you for your righteous anger. We thank you for using moments and scenes in your life to remind us of things that are important that we often forget. But God, forgive us for the times that we come like tourists and not like pilgrims. And also help us to be your hands and your feet